Hello lovelies, in this video we're going to be looking at fertility treatment for your GCSE biology. So looking at the impact, the ethics and everything behind it.
Interactions of menstrual hormones. Okay, so we need to be able to talk about how all of the hormones we've talked about are responsible for parts of menstruation, how they interact with each other. And you may get a graph that looks something like this. So we kind of need to be used to seeing graphs like this and then be able to interpret them, but just explain what's going on with all of the hormones. So I'll try and do it in the order that the hormones kind of interact with each other through the cycle. So hopefully that will make sense. So FSH, we're going to start with that one because that causes the eggs to mature in the ovaries. It also stimulates the ovaries to produce estrogen. So there's an interaction. FSH causes the ovaries, that's a target organ or gland, to produce estrogen. So that makes sense because if you're maturing an egg, you need to make sure that where the egg is going to go, the lining of the uterus, is being built up, ready to receive that egg if it's fertilized. Next, that estrogen that we've just caused to be increased by FSH stops FSH production. So this is a negative feedback loop. So increased FSH causes estrogen to be released, but as estrogen gets high, the levels get high, it stops FSH from being produced. So that's a negative feedback loop. This is good because the estrogen stops the FSH from getting too high or being stimulated too much so that we only have one egg maturing at a time. The estrogen increase also stimulates LH production, and obviously that is going to release our egg from the ovary. So that's good because obviously the estrogen, when it gets high enough, will stimulate the ovulation because the estrogen has built up that lining ready. So the LH peaks at ovulation. So the high point of LH is when the egg is released, and then it decreases. That high peak of LH reduces estrogen production. So that's again negative feedback. Estrogen causes LH production, but when it gets too high, it stops the estrogen production. Progesterone increases and remains high to maintain the uterus lining. So that's kind of our last one. So we go FSH, estrogen, LH, progesterone. So the progesterone interactions are that it inhibits the LH and the FSH. This is to make sure that no more eggs are matured or released from the ovaries because in theory, high levels of progesterone being maintained is because we want there to be a pregnancy. So we want there to be a fertilized embryo. So we don't want to be releasing any more eggs if we are pregnant. If there's no fertilization takes place though, there's no embedding of an embryo into the uterus lining, then you'll see the progesterone decrease, it drops down, and that is what triggers menstruation. Because if we have a low level of progesterone, then we lose our uterus lining. So it drops off and then comes out through the vagina as a period. So hopefully that makes sense. We need to be able to talk about the order and what happens in this sequence and explain why it's important that each of these hormones does its job and why the interactions between them are important as well. So these are the interactions. FSH stimulates the ovaries to produce estrogen. Estrogen stops FSH production, but estrogen stimulates LH production. LH reduces estrogen production, and then progesterone inhibits both LH and FSH. Okay, so I've summarised it here in a little table, just because I know that was a lot of writing and some people might need a bit more of a summary. So if levels of FSH are increasing, they will be acting on the ovaries and causing estrogen to be produced. The reason is the uterus lining begins to develop, ready for the egg. If the hormone estrogen is increasing, it's going to act on the pituitary gland and cause LH production to increase. This makes sure that the egg is only released when the uterus lining is ready to receive it. Increasing estrogen also acts on the pituitary gland to inhibit FSH production. This is to make sure that only one egg matures in a cycle. And then increasing progesterone again acts on the pituitary gland because it inhibits FSH and LH to prevent any other eggs maturing or being released during pregnancy, which is what it believes might happen at the start. And then obviously if that doesn't happen, the progesterone falls away and then the cycle will restart again. So it only stops and it only continues to increase progesterone and maintain the lining if there is a fertilized embryo implanted into the uterus. If not, we go back to the start, we go through menstruation and the cycle starts again. Okay, so now we're going to look at those hormones again, but in the context of fertility treatments. Fertility is the ability to have children through sexual reproduction and pregnancy. Infertility, or being infertile, is the inability to conceive, so the inability to become pregnant. Fertility treatments involve the injection of FSH and LH hormones in order to mature eggs and release them from the ovaries. This helps to increase the chance of fertilization, and this might be all that's needed to help someone become pregnant. However, if those fertility drugs do not work, or there is an issue with the sperm, which is the issue and the reason that conceiving is not happening, then in vitro fertilization, or IVF, can help. In vitro literally means in the glass, from the Latin, and that kind of refers to a test tube, and the idea is if something is done in vitro, it's done in the lab instead of in a living body or organism. So in IVF, the sperm and an egg cell form a fertilized embryo in a lab with the help of technicians. The first IVF baby was born in 1978, so this technology has been around for a long time. And today, the procedure is pretty mainstream, and it's estimated there's been about 8 million IVF babies born worldwide. Okay, so let's go through the steps in the IVF process. So large doses of FSH and LH are used, and that's the same as the fertility drug treatment, in order to make sure that there's lots of eggs maturing and being released from the ovary, and these can then be collected. This is done in a small operation. They're literally kind of sucked out with a large kind of needle pipette, and then they can be frozen, ready to be used. A sample of sperm is also collected, and again, that can be frozen, ready to use as well. One egg cell and some sperm are put together in a dish and fertilization occurs. This may occur naturally, but if there's an issue, then the sperm can literally be directly injected into the nucleus of the egg cell. Once fertilization has occurred, we've formed an embryo. The embryo is left to develop into a ball of cells to check that it's alive and able to divide, and it can be genetically screened at this point for disorders if that is part of the reason why someone might be doing IVF, is to make sure that they don't produce a child that has an inherited genetic disease, and we'll talk about that when we look at genetic diseases in the next topic. It's then inserted or implanted into the uterus, so it goes back into the body, and then it's going to develop just as a normal pregnancy would. IVF is one of these scientific technologies that we need to be able to debate the issues and evaluate the risks and the ethical issues around using it. It's very physically and emotionally stressful. I personally have known quite a few people to go through this process, and it can be very stressful, emotional, and upsetting on everyone involved, especially as the average chance of success is not much higher than a normal pregnancy. And this decreases the older that you get. So actually, although you'd go through all of this effort, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're any more likely to get pregnant than if you were doing it the normal way, and that can mean that there is a high chance of miscarriage. There is also a high chance of multiple births. There used to be a method where they would implant more than one embryo, so they'd fertilize two and implant multiple embryos, but that resulted in so many twin births, which are actually quite dangerous for both the mother and the babies because they can be born premature, which means they're very, very small and unable to survive. And also a twin birth can be dangerous for the mother as well. And so they've actually stopped that now. So they will only implant one embryo at a time now if you're going through IVF. So there's a high chance of miscarriage, as I said, which means failed implantation. So the embryo might implant, but then the pregnancy might fail. Or you could get pregnant, but at some point during the pregnancy can fail. And that is obviously very upsetting and distressing for everyone involved. It's also very expensive. It's about £5,000 or more per implantation. So that is without the drugs beforehand to increase the fertility, and then also the paying for the freezing of all of the gametes, so the sperm and the eggs, or the embryos once they've been fertilized. There's a lot of money involved because it is still quite a technical procedure. There are some ethical issues. So similar to when we spoke about stem cells, some people disagree with us producing these fertilized embryos because they're normally multiple embryos produced, but maybe only 1 or 2 used if people only want to have 1 or 2 children, and the rest of those embryos will then be destroyed. And people are not so happy about this because obviously they see that once an egg has been fertilized and it is an embryo, it is a potential human life. But we know that these cells can then be donated for stem cell research.
Ouch! This is why in some videos I'll explain scratches.